to make a video today about a topic which has been ongoing for me, of course, the Syrian civil war, but as you might be noticing, I'm going to be touching on a couple other countries and their ongoing conflicts out in the Middle East and Northern Africa as well. Um, I guess the main topic of this video is going to be demonstrating the way in which Western media outlets frame the debate over what's going on in Syria and how you're going to see the same repetitive kind of negative things happening, but the way that the media frames them sort of attempts to portray them in an acceptable light. So what we're going to start with over here is, we have an assault that's been going on. This has been covered in most of the major news outlets. An assault going on in Syria, trying to sort of take over some new territory away from ISIS, which of course, ironically, the U.S. Started, funded, trained, all that other stuff to begin with. And what's interesting is that we have another group of foreign fighters and things like that teaming up to fight ISIS. So essentially what we have is a group of fighters comprised of various, different tangential Arab fighting forces, along with the Kurdish YPG, getting together to try to lead this assault on ISIS. Now, there is literally no difference between these groups and ISIS technically, other than the fact that these groups are temporarily aligned with U.S. interests, and they, of course, don't quite have the size of ISIS, which is why they're being given support, because they're not yet out of control. The U.S. can kind of keep them under their thumb for now. But this is exactly how ISIS began in the first place. The U.S. wanted a force to go in that wasn't the U.S. Army to take care of Assad. So under the guise of, a civil war and under the guise of trying to take down a dictator, they essentially fund ISIS, and ISIS gets completely out of control and turns into the group that they are today, in the way that we think of them. And now we are doing the exact same thing to fund groups to fight ISIS. Now, this might seem like a mistake, and I hear a lot of people say that we don't really understand how to incorporate what we've observed into our foreign policy, but I would argue that this is actually the point. This is benefiting national interests for countries like Israel that are interested in creating chaos in the Middle East, which serves their own benefits. They're able to essentially remain at the top of the power structure out there. They're allowed to remain at the top of being sort of the recipient of all the U.S. aid and the U.S. favoritism. And economically, now that they're trying to be a bigger player in the oil market with the fields that have been discovered recently out by them, it only serves their interest to keep these areas not just under their thumb, but in chaos so that they can't recover. We've already discussed in previous videos of mine how oil pipeline territory is involved in the Syrian civil war. You guys should check that out if you haven't seen it. So also it kind of benefits a lot of the different, defense contractors for American companies who donate to American re-election campaigns and things like that. Gives us an excuse to remain in the Middle East. So I've been over all this in previous videos, but there's obviously benefits. The main point I want to, put out there is the fact that it's not really a mistake. This is exactly what was supposed to happen, according to the people who have planned all these different, events to happen. So I'm trying to point out the exact same thing that we did that started ISIS is what's taking place now. It's all done on purpose. It benefits, the right people, the people at the top. Now, you're going to see here, this article came out yesterday. Turkey was getting upset because, of course, they hate the Kurds. Kurds hate them. They've fought for a long time. And the YPG is a group which ordinarily Turkey would be, engaged in combat with, except that now, temporarily, they have to let it go because they're helping out the U.S., and the U.S. pretty much, tells them what to do. So you're going to see a follow-up article today where Turkey's kind of letting it go because they say, oh, there's such a small minority within the fighting group, and of course we have to take out ISIS, so, we're going to let this slide and everything's cool. It's pretty much just their way of saying, we get the point, we'll let it go. Now, at the same time, we have to ask ourselves, is this a pattern, the pattern I was discussing earlier of, supporting all these different rival militias and keeping us in a perpetual war? Is this something that we're going to see as a pattern elsewhere? Well, does anybody remember Libya? We still have tons of fighting going on over there. We have tons of fighting that's been taking place ever since the U.S. declared that it was a victory when Gaddafi was killed, even though the lives of the average Libyan has just gone downhill day after day since that's taken place. There's been no peace. There's been no legitimacy to the country's day-to-day functioning. They are not being helped by these world powers, and now there's even more fighting being advanced and funded by US-backed groups. Who else? So once again, the same players are all involved, and once again, the same people are benefiting, even though it looks like this wasn't what was supposed to happen. So now we're thinking, okay, we see it in Syria, which is ongoing. We see it in Libya, which we were told was over, but is clearly ongoing. But that was kind of a few years ago. Well, does the pattern continue? Well, what's happening in Iraq? Does anybody remember Fallujah, one of the places that we had some of the most heavy fighting for U.S. troops, where tons of U.S. soldiers got killed, and where some of the, from what I was researching, some of the hardest fighters from Al Qaeda and all these different groups were, uh, you know, basically living and fighting from. Well, we're still fighting in Fallujah, guys, and elsewhere, and all these other cities that we've heard about. Iraq is still completely in shambles. Can we go back one more step? Afghanistan, we're still talking to the Taliban in Afghanistan, guys. It's like 2001 all over again. And it's pretty much at this point I'd stop, because if I were to continue and say, have all the conflicts that we've started, pretty much not been resolved? Is everything still as bad as it was pretty much everywhere? It basically is. So, I mean, I'm just trying to show you that this pattern is very, very repetitive, and this is what's going to keep happening unless we essentially are able to stop the political cycle from perpetuating this. We have to stop the idea that voting for people is going to somehow change these things, because, as we can see, both parties are simply outdoing each other, one administration at a time. So we'll end with that.